The other point about fiqh that I would like to mention in this connection is that of the hudud punishments, the penal law, as it was developed by fiqh, because it relates, of course, to apostasy and blasphemy. There is a disagreement among the fuqaha, among the lawyers, as to whether apostasy is, the punishment for apostasy is part of hudud or not. But whether it is or not, I think we have to note that the penal law of Islam in relationship to theft, for instance, the cutting off of the hand, the punishment for robbery, which is crucifixion, and the cutting off of the opposite limbs, and the punishment for adultery, which is rajm, which is stoning to death in the case of a married person, or 100 lashes in the case of those who are not married. I mean, those are all part of hudud punishments. Now, the punishment, therefore, for apostasy has to be understood in that context. Coming to apostasy, contrary to what people think, the Quran does say there is a punishment for apostasy. Adab adim, a great punishment. But it is not in this life. The punishment is in the next life. And the question that has arisen is that although the Quran has no punishment in this life for apostasy, on the face of it anyway, how is it that all the schools, all the madahib of fiqh, all the schools of Islamic law prescribe the death penalty for male adults who commit apostasy? How did that come to be? Among the Shia and among the Hanafi school, the penalty for women is not death for apostate women, but to be confined, to be detained until they recant. And there is a very interesting example of this going on in Iran at this time, where two Christian women, Maryam and Marzieh, have been in prison. From time to time they are brought to the courts. They are asked to renounce their Christian faith. When they refuse, they are sent back to prison. And in theory this could go on indefinitely. Now, as I say, every school of law prescribes the death penalty in some way, certainly for males, people who are in possession of their faculties and so on. How did this come to be if on the face of it there is no penalty in this life prescribed in the Quran for rida, that is to say apostasy, or for a murtad, that is to say an apostate? Some people say that in fact there are penalties that are referred to in the Quran for apostates. So in the second surah, Surah Al-Baqarah, it says that an apostate's life is barren, habata, is barren both in this life and in the next. And that is taken to mean that it is barren because he has been punished for his apostasy. Then in another place, in the fourth surah, An-Nisa, it is said that if people desert you, then you must kill them wherever you find them. And that is taken also to be a warrant for the traditional punishment for apostates. Now, in fact, throughout history, apostates have quite often been punished by death. And the definition of apostasy was quite often those who disagreed with the ruler. So the famous case of the Sufi Sheikh Mansour al-Hallaj is an example of, because he had said, I am the truth, ana al-haq, this was taken to be heresy, to be making himself equal with God, and Hallaj was crucified. So many of the references to crucifixion in Islamic poetry are not about the cross of Jesus, but about Hallaj. This is quite often not understood. Professor Akbar Ahmad, who teaches here in Washington, has just written 2 plays. One of them is about the execution of Dara Shikoh, the elder brother of the Emperor Aurangzeb, who was executed for apostasy by his brother who had taken over the throne from what was rightfully Dara's. It's a play worth reading because Professor Ahmad describes the process for the trial and the conviction and the execution of an apostate, even if he is the crown prince. So the punishment is not just something in theory, it has actually happened to people and continues to happen in our own day. Both Maududi and Qutb have argued for the traditional penalty for apostasy, but there are others who are asking questions about it. So it is quite often said that the Quran does not have any punishment for apostasy, so why should the Sharia? And when it is pointed out that the penalty for apostasy is based on a saying, a hadith of the Prophet of Islam, which is, if anyone changes his religion, kill him, then the strength and the veracity of this hadith is called into question by a number of Muslim scholars themselves. Some say, for instance, that this is ahad gharib. This is one of those traditions that relies on a single source and a single chain of narrators. And it is therefore in its very transmission unreliable. Others, of course, say that the very source is unreliable. So doubt is cast about the strength and the veracity of the hadith on which the punishment relies. Others, and the Ahmadiyya, I was interested that you mentioned them. Mirza Tahir Ahmad, the 5th Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya, says that no hadith even can trump the Quran, and that if a hadith does not agree with the Quran and indeed with other ways of the practice and the sayings of the Prophet, then you can't say that it is true. Its veracity has to be questioned. And the Ahmadiyya, of course, have been in the forefront against the battle about apostasy and its penalty, partly because they have been very often the victims of it. But it's not just them. Very orthodox scholars have also expressed reservations. It is pointed out, for instance, that the second caliph, the Caliph Umar, was remarkably reluctant to apply the death penalty for apostasy. He believed it should be imprisonment. And he was followed in this by several of the fuqaha of the Islamic lawyers. More recently, from the 1950s onwards again, Al-Azhar, the premier place of Sunni learning in Cairo, has again and again expressed reservations about the death penalty for apostasy, And 2 years ago, I did a public lecture with Sheikh Tantawi, the rector of Al-Azhar, in which he said clearly in this lecture in Cairo that Egyptians were free to believe whatever they liked. It was not the business of the state to punish them. I thought that was a very courageous thing for Sheikh Tantawi to say in public in Cairo, and this has been followed up by a fatwa delivered by the Darul Ifta in Cairo under the presidency of Sheikh Ali Goma, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, that apostasy is not punishable in this life. So there's been a considerable movement in these areas. At the same time, of course, people continue to be attacked and to imprisoned for apostasy. Even in Egypt, we've had the case of Naguib Mahfouz, the very famous novelist, of Nasser Abu Zaid, the university professor, and now this Christian girl, Inas Mahmoud Hassan, who has been imprisoned. So who do you believe? And certainly those who experience the difficulty, it is not enough to say to them that the Grand Mufti or the Sheikh of Al-Azhar have said, you mustn't suffer like this, because that is what is happening to them. Coming now from apostasy to blasphemy, naturally apostasy is something that happens only to Muslims. It's people, those who renounce Islam in one way or another according to Muslim understanding. Blasphemy is something the crime of sab, or in Persian Gustakhi Rasul or Gustakhi Quran. These are crimes that can also be committed by non-Muslims. That's the difference, if you like. Once again, the tradition is that anyone who commits blasphemy against the Prophet or the Quran should be killed. His life is forfeit. And this is the unanimous opinion of the fuqaha, of the scholars. And indeed, when the Sharia court, the federal Sharia court in Pakistan, changed the punishment for blasphemy under Pakistan Penal Code 295C from the possibility of life imprisonment to a mandatory death sentence, they were relying on the unanimous position of the ulama on this matter. So the court had no choice according to the court. Certainly it can be said that the blasphemy law has changed the entire atmosphere for religious freedom in Pakistan. It has changed the generally good relations between the communities, Muslim and non-Muslim, into relationships of mistrust, of suspicion, and generally of a greater distancing between the communities. This is very regrettable, and this is quite apart from the rank abuse of the law, where personal quarrels, disputes about property, all sorts of things now are settled, as it were, by the Muslim party accusing the non-Muslims, or even sometimes other Muslims, of blasphemy. And then the person is taken into custody, maybe sometimes for their own protection. A long period of uncertainty. They're almost always convicted by the lower courts, and always that conviction has been overturned in the higher courts, but at very great cost. In one case, a high court judge who acquitted someone who had been convicted of blasphemy was himself murdered. So the cost is very high. But it has made the situation of non-Muslim communities very insecure indeed, because it is now not only an individual but a whole community. In the latest cases, the whole community was accused of desecrating the Holy Quran.